So welcome back, everybody, to our Policy Lab presentations. We got off to a great start. Looking forward to another lively conversation with the group working on competitive markets in the age of algorithms. And our team is Isabella Coronado Doria, Angelina Freeman, Elijah Maubert, Husein Pumaya Yakubu. And I'm not missing anybody. It's the four of you, right? So as with before, we're going to give the team 30 minutes. Then we're going to give our jury 10 minutes, faculty and others, and of course our sponsor organization. And then we'll open it up to wider questions. And we've got until 2 p.m. for this group. So we are looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much.
On y va.
In August 2024, a group of people gathered around an event venue to protest against Ticketmaster dynamic pricing. Dynamic pricing is a type of algorithmic pricing, and what algorithmic pricing does is that it uses certain inputs, like, for example, information about the weather, information about supply and demand, and even the characteristics of the consumers to set the perfect price for a good or a service. The people that gathered around the venue were very angry because the tickets for the Oasis concert started at 160 euros. And as more people started going on the website to buy it and clicking on them, the prices went up. So it ended up prices of around 400 euros, which rose questions about the fairness of the use of these pricing tools. Even though this might sound like something new, algorithmic pricing has been around for a very long time. Airlines have been using algorithmic pricing for years now, and that is the reason why we often pay different prices for the same plane ticket. Nonetheless, with the rise of artificial intelligence, these algorithms have become much more powerful because there is now more capacity to process information, and it has made these type of tools even more beneficial for firms because it helps reduce their costs and increase their revenues. In the case of the Canadian context, for example, it is no longer used only in airlines. It is also used now, for example, in e-commerce, retail, and you can even see it in utilities. And even though algorithmic pricing has been around for a long time already, algorithmic pricing that's fueled by AI or other tech is relatively new. So there is not a lot of information that can help us have an idea of how this plays out in the Canadian context. But for the purpose of our research, we have used some proxies that help us paint a picture. So we've gathered, for example, that in Canada, over 1,500 firms are currently developing AI technologies, of which around 60 are specifically targeting and creating algorithms for pricing. And we've also gathered that 6.1% of Canadian businesses have integrated automated decision making, of which algorithmic pricing is one of them. Even though algorithmic pricing has all of these benefits for firms, it can also create challenges for competition. We care about competition because if there's competition in an economy, there's more incentive for innovation. There is usually more productivity, and as you may already know, it can lead to lower prices, which help with the overall well-being of consumers. For our research, we have identified mainly 3 challenges that come with the use of algorithmic pricing. The first one is market concentration. So in order to develop the algorithms, there is a need for a lot of data and computing power, which means that there is very few firms that can actually develop these algorithms. This ends up hurting smaller firms because accessing algorithmic pricing can be costly for them, but also even if they do so, it cannot be as good as the ones that are developed in-house by the firms that already have enough resources to do so. The second challenge that we've identified is the abuse of dominance. Algorithmic pricing can help, for example, a firm to know for how long it could keep a very low price to undercut competitors. And a great example that you might know about this is Amazon Basics, who have recently been known for lowering significantly the prices to take out competitors of the market. And once competitors are out, they slowly start increasing them to increase their revenues. And the last one that it's a great focus of our work, it's tacit collusion. And here I just want to point out that algorithmic pricing can also help firms with explicit collusion, because it helps facilitate, for example, colluding with competitors and fixing prices. But for our specific project, we have focused on tacit collusion. That is when these algorithms learn to collude without explicit human intervention. And an example we have of this is the example of Euritas in the EU, where a lot of firms had the exact same algorithmic pricing provider. And they ended up having the exact same price, which mimicked collusion or price fixing, but they actually never had communication between them. Canadian regulators are well aware of how algorithmic pricing is significantly reshaping the markets in Canada. They are aware of these challenges, but they are specifically aware of how difficult it is to regulate them because of how fast technology is evolving. An example of how this has played out and of this awareness that Canadian regulators have is that they've been modernizing and updating the regulatory tools. For example, the Competition Bureau has been amended around 3 times since 2022, and the Competition Bureau has also recently developed a new branch that's called the Digital Enforcement and Intelligence Branch, which basically helps them identify how can they better enforce the Competition Act in a context where there is constant technological changes. But we've identified that even there is these efforts toward updating mandates and changing regulatory tools, there is also certain challenges in the regulatory sphere. For example, to regulate algorithmic pricing, there is multi-actor oversight. There's different bodies of regulators, for example, the CRCT, Privacy Commissioner of Canada, the Copyright Board, the Competition Bureau, and they all have a different piece of the puzzle of algorithmic pricing. This has created something that we called regulatory uncertainty, which also hurts smaller firms because they usually don't have the legal capacity to easily adapt to changes in regulation. We've also identified that the way regulation has been done in the traditional way usually follows more of a slower, rigid path, starts with a question, research, solution, but the way tech is being developing doesn't necessarily follow that same path, which creates challenges for regulation. And finally, because algorithmic pricing doesn't really have a very clear geographical boundary, there is a need for aligning the different tools that regulators in different jurisdictions are using. And we have found, for example, that Canada has more of a study-first approach, while other jurisdictions like the EU have developed more of an ex-ante preventive one.
Perfect. So now with a bit of a background setup and an overview of the Canadian regulatory landscape, I'd like to call your attention to the specific challenge question which has been posed to us by our sponsors, the Competition Bureau. So over the duration of this policy lab, the team and I have been working to identify the risks and harms associated with the use of algorithmic pricing and how to mitigate those without sacrificing the benefits that this technology promises, specifically within the Canadian context. Isabella's already alluded to 3 main issues that come as a direct consequence of algorithmic pricing in the form of abusive dominance, market concentration, and this new risk of tacit collusion. But if we take a step back, we also see broader issues posed to the regulatory systems in terms of trying to keep pace with this evolving and emergent technology. With that said, the team and I have come up with a proposal which we think is able to actually address the 3 issues that are direct consequence of algorithmic pricing, as well as the broader issue to the regulatory landscape. What we're going to be proposing is called a competition by design framework, and we believe that it is a proactive, inclusive, and flexible strategy. I'm going to take you through why these three pillars are essential for the solution in terms of AI governance within Canada, and I'll also walk you through some alternatives that the team thought about internally and then went out to stress test with the relevant experts and stakeholders. So the first key pillar is going to be keeping pace with AI innovation. As Isabella and I have already mentioned, the traditional regulatory landscape and process is a bit more rigid and slow. And when you're dealing with technology which evolves on a weekly or even monthly basis, this just doesn't cut it. There is an enforcement gap, and we need to fill that now. For us, what we're going to be proposing is going to be a proactive standard which rather than detect technological change and deal with the issues once they've arisen, once they've happened, we'd be looking to anticipate them beforehand. This is also going to have the benefit for Canada in terms of being able to position themselves as a global leader rather than just a governance follower. The second pillar for us is going to be prevention over detection. One of the main issues that we've found in the face of tacit collusion is this black box nature with algorithms. In key stakeholder meetings with groups like MILA here in Montreal, we found that it's incredibly difficult for regulators to detect when tacit collusion or algorithmic coordination has occurred. And even if we are able to detect it, it's an open question right now whether antitrust law could actually reach the cases of harm, because as it stands, it's not clear whether there's been that meeting of minds between two competitive firms' algorithms. For us, therefore, the solution is going to be having built-in technical safeguards akin to what we've seen with the privacy by design framework, which has been implemented globally and which embeds safety protection into the actual technology systems before they hit the markets. The third pillar is going to be leveling the playing field. One of the key pain points that our research identified is the fact that there's a widening gap between the smaller players and the bigger players. Isabella already mentioned the fact that Canada does face a lot of regulatory uncertainty because we just don't have any AI regulation right now. It's the big players who are able to navigate this. They can afford to operate in the gray areas where they accrue the benefits that algorithmic pricing affords them, all the while knowing that if they do get into legal challenges, they have the resources to get into that. The smaller players in our research and in our stakeholder engagement, they just said they can't do that. Although we gave you the statistic of a 6.1% increase in firms willing to use this technology, it was very heavily skewed towards the bigger players. So, with that said, I'd also like to touch upon some alternatives which we did discuss internally, one of the main ones being the legislative route. One of the main issues that we found with this approach is that it's incredibly difficult to hit a moving target, and that's exactly what algorithmic pricing is. Canadian regulators simply don't know who is using these technologies, how they're using them, so it's incredibly difficult to say, hey, we're going to regulate this in a very hard and stringent way. And when we look internationally, for example, although the EU has their ex-ante approach, it's going back to the drawing board because compliance is a bit too tricky, and they actually don't have any standards by which firms can go and check to know whether they're in compliance with what the bloc has deemed to be safe competition. We don't want Canada to be in a position where they're pushing for legislation and have to take it back to the drawing board 6 months down the line. An alternative that we also did consider is the concept of regulatory sandboxing. This is being trialed in Spain, for example, and it's essentially a playground where you invite firms to come and test their innovative technologies in a simulated and controlled environment. This just doesn't work here in Canada because it's incredibly difficult to incentivize firms to come and play in that sandbox when they know that they could risk leaking their secret source or the IP behind their algorithms. So, therefore, that's why we've gone with our proactive, inclusive, and flexible strategy by competition by design. Now with the framework of the actual strategy laid out, I want to get into the actual 4 phases that our proposal will work through. I'm going to go over a high-level overview before I hand it off to Pumaya and Angelina, who will take you through some of the more granular details. So, step 1 is going to be creating a public registry and a self-assessment tool. As I mentioned, there is a knowledge gap for Canadian regulators. This needs to be addressed. That's what we're going to be doing with a public registry, whereby we'd incentivize firms to come and register saying that they are using algorithmic pricing, and they can also tell us how. On the side of the Canadian regulators, there'd also be a self-assessment tool, which gives them access to the ways in which companies are actually using these systems and how it's impacting the markets. An important thing to note here is that the self-assessment tool is going to give the data to the regulators, but it is going to be de-identified. Therefore, firms don't need to worry about having more proactive regulation on their side, but they also know that they won't be at risk. Step 2 is going to be issuing what we've coined a competition by design principle. Through extensive consultation with academia, with industry, and with the relevant experts, we'd be looking to actually identify what it is we mean by competition by design in a competitive and digital age for Canada. We envision, for example, having things like hard coding against coordination between competitive firms' algorithms, but this is something that would have to be discussed further. Isabella already alluded to the Digital Enforcement and Intelligence branch, and we think they're perfectly placed to host these kinds of conversations. Moving on to phase 3 is going to be supporting the development of a standard. So as Isabella mentioned, there are a multitude of actors within this ecosystem, and one of the ones I'd like to call your attention to is going to be the Standards Council of Canada, the SEC. They're going to be integral to this phase, and we envision having that Competition Bureau, through their advocacy and promotion branch, reach out to them and begin the process for setting a national standard which has specific technical stipulations, regulations, and specificities. Step 4 is going to be promotion of the actual standard. We've identified the CDRF, that's the Canadian Digital Regulators Forum, as a key mechanism here for us to get the message out to the market and to consumers alike that there is now a standard by which firms know they can comply with what the Bureau deems to be safe and fair competition with the use of AP systems. With the 4 phases now outlined, I'm going to hand it over to Pumaya, who's going to take you through the details.
Thank you very much, Elijah. So what we are proposing is fairly simple. We want to have a standard, and just like any other standard, it is mostly voluntary. And another problem that we need to address before we get into developing the standard is to get a general understanding of how firms generally use these software, the kind of data that is fed into it, and what kind of instructions are given to them. Since we don't have that data readily available, it's important to start by having a registry. The purpose of this registry is to invite firms to communicate to the Competition Bureau exactly how they use pricing algorithms, the kind of data that they put into it, and what kind of instructions they give to them. Now, this phase is important because we need to have that critical mass. Otherwise, when the standard rolls out, we are not going to have a lot of people willing to partake in it. So this is also an opportunity for us to understand just what the need is for a standard like this within the market. Then we can begin to roll it out. One key implementation consideration for this phase is for the Competition Bureau to have genuine outreach and trust building. We need to communicate to the firms that participating in this stage does not mean you are subjecting yourself for investigation by the Competition Bureau. On the contrary, you are contributing to the development of a solution into a problem that is evolving, that one way or the other is going to be regulated in the future. So being part of this gives you an upper hand so that you can put your matters in order, put your house in order, so that the Competition Bureau doesn't come after you in the future. Another thing that we need to consider when building this standard or this form is to ensure that it provides enough information to be useful but not too detailed to feel invasive. We envision that some firms will be hesitant to participate in this because they don't want to expose their pricing practices, and so we need the form to be done in such a way that we just have the right amount of information to be able to gather necessary feedback. Then we would not have we are not asking them to deliver on the secret source that they practice their business with. Also, once the data begins to come in, it's important for the Competition Bureau to take urgent steps to analyze and act on them. We don't want the platform to be just an information gathering platform, but a platform where firms can learn about what their practices are and how they can begin to change things before we roll out the standard. Once all this is done, the Competition Bureau will need to take active steps to also publish case studies, summaries, and lessons. Like Elijah mentioned, this data is going to be anonymized, so we are not going to attach any information to a particular firm. What we are doing is that to give a general understanding of what the Competition Bureau things is within the threshold of fair competition, then firms can begin to make the necessary adjustments so that they can compete in the market in a fair and equitable way. Once this phase is completed, we have the data, the Competition Bureau would have to issue what we call the competition by design principle. Now, what we are trying to do is fairly new, and so we need to have as much information as possible to be able to tell, or to be able to serve as a foundation based on which a standard will be built. So by issuing the principle, the Competition Bureau is going to be relying on its publishing interpretative guidance mandate that they already do. What this means is that the Competition Bureau would normally go into their own act and then decide on some of the contentious parts of it, and then provide guidance to the public on how it interprets this and how firms can be expected to comply. This phase will not be successful if the Competition Bureau does not coordinate with other regulators. The Competition Bureau is just one piece of the pie. It is in charge of making sure that competition is safe within the Canadian economy. But within the economy, there are different sectors. So we have the Canadian Digital Regulators Forum, which is made up of the CTRC and a few other regulators which regulate specific parts of the economy. So in order to have a principle that cuts across different sectors within the economy, it's important to bring their inputs so that when the principle is issued, it can cut across all aspects of the Canadian economy. When we have by building the principle, we expect that it will be built on 6 major pillars. One, the principle should be proactive in making sure that firms prevent collusion. There should also be competitive safeguards as default settings within the software. There should be full functionality without compromising efficiency. There should be end-to-end security against coordination, transparency and visibility in the decision-making mechanism of the software, and lastly, respect for consumer privacy and market integrity. Now that the principle has been issued and everybody has a general understanding of what the Competition Bureau regards as safe competition or not, or how we would want competition, especially with the use of algorithmic pricing software, to go forward, then we can now approach the Standard Council of Canada to develop a standard, that is the phase 3 of our recommendation. Creating a standard in Canada is a fairly straightforward process. It starts by the Competition Bureau or whichever entity that has interest in a particular matter to reach out to the Standard Council of Canada, which is the state institution in charge of creating and managing standards. Once this is done, the Standard Council of Canada would have to reach out to an SDO, which is a standard development organization, which then takes charge of the process. Now, before a standard is created, there's a need to establish that the need for it exists. And based on the detailed report that we have, as well as the stakeholder interviews, as well as trying to look at the other solutions that may exist, we believe that the need has been clearly established and the Standard Council of Canada can proceed with their internal processes to create the standard. As part of creating the standard also would be to form a technical committee which the Competition Bureau can form part of. It will also be made up of people from academia, people from law, and people from consumer protection groups. Bring their inputs on board to ensure that the standard actually meets the Canadian needs and to make sure that competition is fair in the age of algorithmic pricing. Once this is done, we expect that the Standard Council of Canada, through the SDO that essentially wins this bid, would do some public consultation and finalize the standard. What this does is that we ensure that we have a multitude of voices so that when the standard is taken out there, we have a lot of people willing to take and willing to participate in it. This is on the side of the Standard Council of Canada, but we believe that the Competition Bureau also has an important role to play within this phase to make sure that when the standard is actually published, people are willing and able to participate in it. And to tell you more about that is Angelina.
Thank you so much, Pumaya, for that. So now that we have the standard created, the final phase is to promote the certification and integrate this into the Competition Bureau's existing compliance guidance. We believe that the Competition Bureau, along with other regulators through the Canadian Digital Regulators Forum, should play an active role in promoting the standard to legitimize it in the eyes of both firms and consumers. To begin, we believe that the standard promotion phase should have 2 steps. During the first 6 months, we suggest a more intensive advertising approach because the standard would not have been sort of in the public eye before, and so an aggressive advertising campaign is needed to plant the idea in the heads of the Canadian public, followed by a much longer but more settled phase of sort of maintaining this level of awareness that has been established. In regards to the target audience, we believe that there should be a couple different ways of approaching this. First, we think it's important to include consumers in the advertising and outreach. While they, of course, are not going to be obtaining the standard, if consumers begin to demand that firms that they transact with are certified under the standard, this can increase the value of the standard in the market and therefore encourage more firms to actually get certified. Additionally, of course, you're going to want to do outreach to firms, and this can be broken down in a couple of ways. First, there are the firms who actually create the algorithmic pricing tools, and we believe that the Competition Bureau should focus a lot of their efforts here. Isabella mentioned earlier that there are about 60 firms creating these tools in Canada, so imagine if even 10 of them could become certified, how impactful the certification could be, because they also sell these algorithmic pricing tools to other companies. But we could also consider ways that the standard could benefit firms that are either creating their own in-house algorithmic pricing software or those buying a third-party one, which would be showing to their consumers that with the algorithmic pricing software that they are using, the data that is going into it has been done in a fair and pro-competitive way. So we believe kind of all three of these types of firms should be included in the outreach. One of the major challenges with the voluntary standard is, of course, getting firms to participate when they're not mandated to do so. So a major component of this fourth phase should be building incentives for firms to participate into the process. We have a couple of different suggestions for incentives. First, the Competition Bureau should integrate how they are going to approach the standard into their compliance guidance. For example, if the Competition Bureau decided that certified firms are going to be considered lower risk for algorithmic pricing collusion during competition enforcement, that would be an obvious incentive for firms to participate, as it would reduce their risks of being investigated by the Competition Bureau. We could also consider other ways that the Competition Bureau could leverage their partnership with other government agencies to create incentives, such as through suggesting that firms that are certified be listed as primary, like preferred firms for procurement, or listed as an advantage for different government grants or funding opportunities that are available. Once completed, we believe that this proposal will deliver a few different types of benefits. The first is that because smaller firms can see that the Competition Bureau has blessed this standard, it essentially tells them the path forward to avoiding competition enforcement and implementing pro-competitive algorithmic pricing tools, meaning that smaller firms will feel more empowered to access this market and therefore generate competition more broadly. Competition, of course, has a variety of benefits, which could include lower costs, higher product quality, and an increased variety of product choice for consumers, as well as the broader economic benefits that an increase in innovation and efficiency provide, especially noting that the Canadian economy has been looking to boost innovation and productivity that have recently stagnated. Additionally, there's the benefit of an international advantage, which is that as standards become increasingly common globally, there's an opportunity for Canada to insert their perspective on pro-competitive algorithmic pricing into the global standard, thus creating a global standard that is well aligned with Canada's values. But additionally, because firms in Canada are interested in competing abroad, if there's a desire for pro-competitive certifications, this is something that Canadian firms will have already done because of the domestic standard. And finally, there's the potential for a legislative head start. Standards are often integrated into legislation, whether that's just borrowing principles or actually mandating legally that firms have to be certified according to a different standard. So having this standard already developed will reduce the cost and duration of forming future legislation. For our proposal, we have estimated, based on information available online and stakeholder consultations, that it will cost about $500,000, assuming modest uptake. About half of this is devoted to the standards development process, so around $250,000, which does align with the typical cost for such a project, according to our conversations with both the Standards Council of Canada and the CSA Group, which is a very prominent standards development organization. However, a lot of this information is done through a request for proposal process that's not widely published online, so you can't be exactly sure. In the development of our project, of course, we considered a variety of risks, the main ones being that firms may not choose to participate, which we've addressed through the advertising and incentives components of our proposal, and the second one being that the standard could be misaligned because of the variety of uncertainties and rapidly changing things that are in this ecosystem, whether that be legislation or technology. We also identified that there are a few design limitations included in our project, the most important ones being the voluntary nature and the fact that the proposal relies on government support to actually fund the development of the standard. With this in mind, however, we have identified that there are currently a variety of windows of opportunity that could really mitigate some of the design limitations built into the project. The first is that standards are becoming increasingly common globally. If you look to the EU, while they had originally taken a more aggressive regulatory and legislative approach, this is coming back to the drawing board as it proved quite difficult. And in fact, they really struggled to develop standards for compliance. So this is an opportunity for Canada globally to sort of promote their ideas and suggest that making a standard is the right approach at this time. The same is kind of true if you look to the US, which is currently moving to ban regulation on AI, meaning that standards could fill this legislative gap. Additionally, we know that Canada recently tried but failed to pass the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, meaning that there's room for some of these standards to be integrated into future legislation. And of course, Canada has recently dedicated a Minister of AI and Digital Innovation, meaning there's likely to be funding and motivation to do this type of thing in the near future. With that, we thank you for your attention today, and we want to reinstate one thing. Algorithmic pricing is already changing our markets, and in a time where there's technological and regulatory uncertainty, the Competition by Design framework gives the Competition Bureau concrete steps to promote proactive, fair pricing in Canadian markets. Thank you.
Thank you, team. Great colors in your slide presentation. It was lovely to look at. Brenda, are you going to start us off with the
sure
jury?
am.
So just a reminder, we're going to give the jury the first set of questions, and then we'll go to the room.
Wonderful presentation. Just like the previous one, you all spoke very confidently, and you've taken a very complex issue and you have gone down deep, and yet your presentation has a nice flow, and I could actually follow along by the skin of my teeth. But I just can't help but make one comment, and that's as an economist, and so is John, so you're outnumbered here. Every economist going back 20 years loved the concept of economic rent. So, all of that Chris Reagan will have talked to you about earlier in the year about willing payer, willing seller, and how do you capture that economic rent. And now we find ourselves doing exactly that with dynamic pricing, and we see the ugly side of it. So the economists who taught all of that 20 years ago, it was before they had tried to call an Uber at prime time or heard your presentation. So there are unintended consequences that only, economic theory goes so far, and then you try and it doesn't work very well. My question to you, and I've got so many questions, I hope I can chat with you later, but the main one, or one of the major ones, is your choice of using the Standards Council in order to kind of manage this process. And my experience with the Standards Council is they typically, at least in the past, dealt much more with kind of technical issues, how a piece of machinery works, or how a certain processing system. It seems to me this is quite a stretch from what they have historically done. So did you talk about the capacity of the Standards Council to take on a project that is quite different than they have historically done, and why that would be the best route? It just seems a bit strange to me.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. And definitely your comment about the economic rent was something that we thought about throughout the duration of the project. In terms of our choice to use the Standards Council, we wanted it to be a national standard, and this is sort of the organization that does it. But we did reach out to them for an interview, as well as the CSA group, who's a standards development organization. And we asked this very question of, would you actually be able to handle developing a standard for something that seems a little atypical? And the response was that it might be a little unorthodox compared to what they've done historically, but not completely unheard of. And if you look to the standards for management systems, this is a lot more aligned there, in that they're not as technical or as industry specific, but rather specific to a tool that can be used across organizations and different industries. So definitely a little bit of a stretch, but it sounded like it would be something that they would be capable of doing. And also just a comment on the phases that we have. So because there will be this outreach registry during phase 1 and then the development of the competition by design principle in phase 2, this is a really good group to this is a really good way to get a better understanding of the experts in the field, and then the Competition Bureau can later suggest maybe a couple of different people that could go on the expert panel. And so having these 2 phases before the standard development phase gives you a bit of a head start in some of the things that actually need to be done during that phase. Yeah, thank you.
Kyle.
I get to go second. Thank you. It was fascinating presentation, really well researched. One thing that jumps out is that just overall focus on this need for transparency. And I'm just curious to know if there were any discussions or research that you were doing about the need for perhaps closed door public audits of these algorithms to see how they're functioning. I know that's always a hard thing to do, but I'm just curious if that came up. I'm also interested to know, you mentioned the EU, but I'm wondering if there are any individual countries that you looked at that is showing leadership that we Canada could look at in this case. And maybe third comment is that you mentioned unique as you did this project, you had Canada has now a Minister of AI and Digital Innovation. However, most of what's coming out of the government and the minister is not about regulation or controlling this. It's really about innovation. So I'm just curious if thinking about trying to push this at the federal level, what other actors besides the minister do you think could be an ally in pushing this public policy? Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for the question. So,
The mic up a bit so we can hear you better. That's good.
okay. Okay, thank you for the question. I'm going to try work back with the 3 different comments. So with the AI minister, we do know that he's focusing less on over-indexing regulation for AI and looking to harness the innovation and the economic benefits that it promises. That's precisely why we've actually, happily enough, gone with the standard. We think that this meshes quite well with him. He has his 4-pillar approach where he wants to build trust and confidence in AI, and we think having a public registry and a certifiable standard would actually be able to do that. We're not really going to be looking for hard regulation or legislation just yet, but as Angelina mentioned, we did model our approach off of things like the privacy by design, which later was reflected in certain statutes like the GDPR. So I understand that although at the federal level there is a bit of hesitancy with AI regulation, we think a standard doesn't have to be regulation. It's more of a proactive approach. Your second comment and question, sorry, could you go again?
I think I mentioned
other countries.
I mentioned about what other individual country is kind of leading on this, and then just about public audits of algorithms.
Yeah, okay. So on the international scene, we have seen the UK, they have created what they've called the AI Standards Hub, which is one centralized body for the AI community in Britain to go to and to better understand whether they are in compliance and to seek help in terms of the technical regulation which they need to be in accordance with. That's something which we think Canada could model themselves off of. Looking further, we also have Singapore, who have established what they've coined the AI Verify framework. It is similar to what we're proposing insofar as it is a voluntary framework where it's up to the firms to come forward if they would like to, and they can pose questions to the authorities to better understand what they could do, what kinds of grants they have for certain innovation programs, and to ensure that they are in compliance with the current law and interpretation of competition authorities. So, the audit question. A very tricky part here is that there's a big gap between science and policy. We firsthand kind of went through it when we had a very technical session with a group of MILA experts who are at the forefront and understand how to conduct these types of audits. For some of the more frontier models which are going to be coming out, it's going to be incredibly difficult, and as it stands right now just isn't possible. For the current legacy models which firms do employ, it is possible. However, necessarily you would have to give up some IP on the firm side. This is tricky because that's a very difficult ask to ask them to give up their secret source, which again is why we didn't go with the regulatory sandboxing. But what we're proposing by having it embedded into the actual technology, that is something you can audit. You could look at what's known as model specs, which is essentially the behavior that you like to elicit from these models. You could kind of reward it for avoiding certain anti-competitive processes or behavior. So for example, you can say, I'm going to be placing you in the hospitality market. However, there are these other players and potential systems. We want you to categorically avoid any interaction with them. That is something that is possible right now versus auditing, which is a bit more challenging.
John.
Okay. Very good work on what I think was probably a pretty challenging topic. A couple of different topics. First, I've had a little bit of engagement with both of those organizations, the Standards Council and Competition Bureau, but not a lot. I suspect that a lot of people in industry perceive the Competition Bureau as a more judicial sort of body, whereas they perceive the Standards Council in a much friendlier sort of interactive way, where they go and attend a working group meeting with a bunch of other people from the industry, and there's a sort of consensus reached about what to do. So there's probably a sort of a trust level, comfort level with the Standards Council that is less present with the Competition Bureau. And it may be that, and the Standards Council has this structure of working groups, and it may be that the Competition Bureau can more use the brand of and that comfort level with the Standards Council as a, create a more trusting, comfortable zone, even if the Standards Council can't necessarily do as much of this as they'd like them to. Now, on the subject of raising awareness of all of this and getting it out there, did you think at all about some sort of consultation process, an online consultation, where rather than sort of just pushing a message to Canadians, especially at the consumer level versus industry, you sort of invite them to submit their thoughts? Maybe something like that was in there and I didn't hear it. What else was I going to say? Also, sorry, back to Standards Council and Competition Bureau. All of this is obviously going to take quite a bit of time, right? These things take a while. So you're going to be a while developing this. Again, that may have been buried in there, but you want to sort of recognize that. Once you get it set up, it may work in a very timely manner, but it's going to take a while to do this.
Thank you.
Okay, some comments and questions
Yeah.
there. Isabella.
Thank you very much for those questions. So in order to develop a recommendation, we actually worked hand in hand with the SEC and the CSA. And one concern that we have was this conflict of interest, because they, as you mentioned, there is a more of a relationship of comfort firms with the standard they are with the Competition Bureau. And while we learned about how the process of standards are made, we learned that it is not unheard of the government actually starting one of these processes. And for that reason, the SEC already, both the SEC and other organizations that develop standards like the CSA already have an established procedure to avoid bias and to help signal, at least to the consumers and the firms and the ones that are going to be subject to these standards, that there is no bias in the process. So one of the ways they do that is, for example, that even if it's the government, the one who are going to finance or the one that are requesting a standard, the way they gather the group of experts that are going to end up writing the standard, they have a formula. I'm not going to go deep on that, but basically what that formula does is it guarantees that there is no organization that has more voice than any other. So in the case of the government, what they've done before in these cases is that if the government is already funding, they're only going to have one spot at the table because they're acting both as funders and regulators, while in other examples there would be a different one for funders, a different one for regulators. So that's for that one. And the other half of the question?
About time and consumer consultation.
Oh yeah. So regarding the time, there is around our estimates, again, throughout the process of consultation we did with the SEC and the CSA, it will take around 18 to 24 months just of the development of the standards. And one key part of the development of the standards is actually consultation. So that is embedded in the process, and it is actually like a little bit more detailed in our brief.
Okay, I'm going to go to our sponsor.
So we have 2 people from the Competition Bureau online.
Okay.
We just need them to raise their hand.
Can you raise your hands, our colleagues from the Competition Bureau? You probably are on mute. We'd love to hear from you.
And meanwhile, while we wait, perhaps there are questions from faculty or anybody.
Faculty or anyone? Oh, Ben, are you there? Hello, Ben? No?
I know there's also Serena.
And
potentially.
Sereno? Okay, while we wait, any comments or questions from our faculty, audience? Taylor's got one. Yep.
Can you hear me? Thanks, that was great. It was so exciting to see this project come together and where it ended up at. 2 quick thoughts, I guess. One, while we have a new AI overlord and vibe in Canada that's all about adoption and not regulation, and that is unquestionably the case,
Yeah.
they can't ignore consumer safety.
100%.
Like they've said they want trust in these systems, right? For widespread adoption. We're supposed to use these things for everything. So then we have to trust them. And that's going to become an issue of consumer safety.
Yep.
So did you look at that as another lens into the standards piece, right? Like to what degree standards can help increase consumer safety and going through that policy lens? The second piece is we know there's a long history of failed self-regulation in this space.
Yep.
And at some point you need teeth to these. So where are the teeth? And can you say a little bit more about those? And could you perhaps put teeth inside the online harms package, for example, which has audit capacity, which has most of the things you're talking about, and the enforcement measure and the commission structure to do it?
Perfect. For the consumer protection question, I think Angelina is best placed.
Yeah, I'll answer the consumer protection, and then I'm going to pass it off for the teeth component. Okay. For the consumer protection, this gets a little bit complicated. So standards can definitely help with consumer protection, and you see this like hockey helmets have a standard. That's great. We like people's brains being protected. But the challenge here is a couple of things in terms of the role of the Competition Bureau and consumer protection legislation more broadly. So as Pearl aptly pointed out, she's not here, consumer protection is a provincial issue. And so this becomes a little bit more complicated when you're sort of advising a federal body on the steps that they can take. And also something sort of the Competition Bureau guided us is that you wanted to look at the interactions of markets and how they're using algorithmic pricing. But I definitely think this is a really important lens that should be looked at, just maybe a little bit outside of the scope of this particular project. Teeth?
Thank you. Yeah. Anyway, thanks for the question. So when we had discussions with the Standard Council of Canada, they did mention that in as much as standards in and of themselves are voluntary, they've had instances about 60% of the standards they've worked on essentially make their way into legislation, maybe just by simply referencing it. So we believe that if Canada continues to work the way it has always worked, then there's a future where we can have the standard made reference to in a legislation, and then it becomes, that's the teeth we can have in that instance. Yeah.
I think also just quickly to touch on that, we have looked at what the potential self-assessment tool could look like, and it looks something like this. This is a very detailed questionnaire and self-compliance toolkit, which would look at the actual data quality, source sharing, data usages, and the way it's actually protected for the firm's use. This is something that we envision being able to be extrapolated on and evolving with the technology as it makes pace into the markets. So although it is a self-assessment and self-regulation for the moment, as Pumaya mentioned, having this as a standard and a foundation to build on once it makes its way into actual statutes, akin to what we saw with the privacy by design making its way into the GDPR, we actually do think that we will be able to fill a gap that does exist currently without having to wait for the legislation to catch up.
Ben from the Competition Bureau, you're online. I think you're unmuted. Do you want to join us with a comment or question?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. So I just wanted to say to start off, it's been a pleasure seeing all of you work through this admittedly quite challenging question. We think that you've done it in a way that demonstrates deep thought and concern for the question. We're talking about something here at the intersection of technology, none of which on their own are simple to understand. And when you put them together, it becomes exponentially more complicated. And I think you've demonstrated quite a clear and profound understanding of the way these things work together. You've done it in a way that's creative. We're looking at something that's not just complex, but that's fundamentally new. As you've mentioned, people around the world are asking these same questions, and we're only just now seeing the emergence of the very beginnings of answers to what we might do about them. And with respect to the issue of answers, I think you've also been bold. You haven't just attempted to diagnose a problem, but you've put forward some creative ideas about how we might go about solving them. So I wanted to say thanks. You've really risen to the challenge that we posed here. And the question, it may be sort of just building on the fact that what your product, what you've produced is a provocation, I think. And as we grapple with these questions ourselves, I'll ask if you would submit your work to our discussion paper consultation that's taking place right now so that we can continue considering your proposals and integrate them into our own thinking as we go forward and try to address these problems in Canada's markets.
Thank you, Ben. It's been a pleasure to work with you and the team.
Other questions? I'm thinking that the whole hockey helmet discussion just reminded me. Guy Lafleur never wore a helmet. Had beautiful hair. I think his brains were intact, but we don't know. We don't know for sure. Other questions from anyone in the group? We still have a few more minutes. Yeah, Tony. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Great presentation. Maybe going on this consumer train a bit, how did you envision actually doing this consumer public awareness? Like, how are you going to target consumers who this is most applicable to? How are you going to make sure that they actually see this and resonate with it? So maybe if you could expand on that. Thanks.
Yeah, Tony, great question. A little bit complex, I think, for sure. So fortunately, the Competition Bureau has a competition promotion branch that does a lot of advocacy work. And so we think that they have probably really good people who do marketing and communications, run their sort of existing public outreach. So we really wanted to rely on some of those resources that already exist in-house at the Bureau. But I think the broader question of sort of which consumers this resonates with might require a bit more work in terms of identifying maybe consumers who are most price sensitive, consumers who are most interested in the business practices, and then my envision would probably be a broad, different types of outreach. So you could do social media, you could do print media, all of the types of kind of traditional advertising strategies. Yeah, thank you.
No. Okay. This is someone online?
No, you need the mic.
Oh, I need the mic. Excuse me. Looking at this beautiful voluntary registry example here. Well done on that. Team, thank you so much. That was a complex challenge. Really, really good questions from the jury about your choice of instrument, about how we think about competition. Great job. Congratulations.
Thank you.